Hello, 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 and happy Thursday, everyone. Good morning, or evening, or afternoon, wherever you are joining us. My name is Amy Bjorklund, and I welcome you to Southwest Shakespeare's Storytime Classics. We are currently smack in the middle of Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. We are about that far in, so if this is the start of the book, this is what we have left to do. And it is getting, as middle of books are wont to, it is intense. They're not intimidating. Well, I guess some of the people are intimidating. It's intense, and she's running. We have Mary Yellan, who is running away from Harry the peddler, who was going to do some not very good things with her. And she has been captured by her uncle, Joss, and she is currently at the ocean side, where he is a wrecker. He and his team wreck ships and kill people on purpose in order to take the things that are on the ship. And I have to say, before reading this, I actually hadn't heard of wreckers, and they sound terrible. And I can see why everyone stays away from Jamaica Inn, because Joss Merlin is a terrible, terrible person. Also, Jem is nowhere to be found. He's not a good guy. So Jem has abandoned her. It's raining. She's been the vicar went home, and then her uncle came and stole her. Not good for Mary. What is good is we have Stanley and Catherine with us again today. Hello, everybody. Hello. Stanley says, good morning. Yes, we are getting close to the end of the story. I would say probably 2 or 3 more readings. We were on page 210 out of 346. So yes, we are close. 130 pages. And good morning, Catherine. Happy Thursday. I also hope Mary gets out of it. You know what I was thinking? And then I will start reading. But I was thinking, unlike Rebecca, which is told in the first person and is told as a flashback, we know she lives through all of this. Like, her life isn't really ever in danger because she's telling the story. This is told third person. I had the thought this morning that she might not make it out. Yes. So I hope she does, because she's really good-spirited and really hard worker and loyal. I like Mary. She makes some bad decisions, but it occurred to me, since it's told in third person, I wonder if she survives. So let's see. Page 210, taking out my trusty coffee book. Nope. Oh man, threw it on the ground. Live. And we are running. She has escaped Harry. We're starting on page 210, 210, and off we go. A wall of fog closed in upon her, obscuring the distant line of heads for which she had been making, and she stopped at once in her headlong rush, aware of the danger of sea mist, and how in its deception it might bring her back to the lane again. She fell at once upon hands and knees and crawled slowly forward, her eyes low to the ground, following a narrow, sandy track that wound in the direction she wished to take. Her progress was slow, but instinct told her that the distance was increasing between her and the peddler, which was the only thing that mattered. She had no reckoning of time. It was 3, perhaps 4 in the morning, and the darkness would give no sign of breaking for many hours to come. Once more, the rain came down through the curtain of mist, and it seemed as though she could hear the sea on every side of her, and there were no escape from it. The breakers were muffled no longer. They were louder and clearer than before. She realized that the wind had been no guide to direction, for even now, with it behind her, it might have shifted a point or two, and with her ignorance of the coastline, she had not turned east, as she meant to do, but was now... but was even now upon the brink of sagging cliff path that, judging by the sound of the sea, was taking her straight to the shore. The breakers, though she could not see them because of the fog, were somewhere beyond her in the darkness, and to her dismay, she sensed they were on level with her and not beneath her. This meant that the cliffs were descended abruptly to the shore, and instead of a long and tortuous path to a cove that she had pictured from the abandoned carriage, the gullyway must have been only a few yards from the sea itself. The banks of the gully had muffled the sounds of the breakers. Even as she decided this, there was a gap in the mist ahead of her, showing a patch of sky. She crawled on uncertainly, the path widening and the fog clearing, and the wind veered in her face once more. And there she knelt amongst driftwood and seaweed and loose shingle on a narrow strand, with the land sloping up on either side of her, while not 50 yards away and directly in front of her were high, combing seas breaking upon the shore. After a while, when her eyes had accustomed themselves to the shadows, she made them out, huddled against a jagged rock that broke up the expanse of the beach. A little knot of men, grouped together for warmth and shelter, silently peering ahead of them into the darkness. Their very stillness made them the more menacing who had not been still before, and the attitude of stealth, the poise of their bodies, crouched as they were against the rock, the tense watchfulness of their heads turned one and all into the incoming sea, was a sight at once fearful and pregnant with danger. Had they shouted and sung, called to one another, and made the night hideous with their clamor, their heavy boots resounding on the crunching shingle, it would have been in keeping with their character and with what she expected. But there was something ominous in this silence, which suggested that the crisis of the night had come upon them. A little jutting piece of rock stood between Mary and the bare exposed beach, and behind this she dared not venture for fear of betraying herself. She crawled as far as the rock and lay down on the shingle behind it, while ahead of her, directly in her line of vision when she moved her head, stood her uncle and his companion with their backs turned to her. She waited. They did not move. There was no sound. Only the sea broke in its inevitable monotony upon the shore, sweeping the strand and returning again, the line of breakers showing thin and white against the black night. The mist began to lift very slowly, disclosing the narrow outline of the bay. Rocks became more prominent, and the cliffs took on solidity. The expanse of water widened, opening from a gulf to a bare line of shore that stretched away interminably. To the right, in the distance, where the highest part of the cliff sloped to the sea, Mary made out a faint pinprick of light. At first she thought it a star piercing the last curtain of dissolving mist, but reason told her that no star was white, nor ever swayed with the wind in the surface of a cliff. She watched it intently, and it moved again. It was like a small white eye in the darkness. It danced and curtsied, storm-tossed, as though kindled and carried by the wind itself, a living flare that would not be blown. The group of men on the shingle below heeded it not. Their eyes were turned to the dark sea beyond the breakers. And suddenly Mary was aware of the reason for their indifference, and the small white eye that had seemed at first a thing of friendliness and comfort, winking bravely alone in the wild night, became a symbol of horror. The star was a false light placed there by her uncle and his companions. The pinprick gleam was evil now, and the curtsy to the wind became a mockery. In her imagination, the light burnt fiercer, extending its beam to dominate the cliff, and the color was white no more, but old and yellow like a scab. Someone watched by the light so that it would not be extinguished. She saw a dark figure pass in front of it, obscuring the gleam for a moment, and then it burnt clear again. The figure became a blot against the gray face of the cliff, moving quickly in the direction of the shore. Whoever it was climbed down the slope to his companions on the shingle. His action was hurried, as though time pressed him, and he was careless in the matter of his coming, for the loose earth and stones slid away under him, scattering down onto the beach below. The sound startled the men beneath, and for the first time since Mary had watched them, they withdrew their attention from the incoming tide and looked up to him. Mary saw him put his hands to his mouth and shout, but his words were caught up in the wind and did not come to her. They reached the little group of men waiting on the shingle, who broke up at once in some excitement, some of them starting halfway up the cliff to meet him. But when he shouted again and pointed to the sea, they ran down towards the breakers, their stealth and silence gone for the moment. The sound of their footsteps heavy on the shingle, their voices topping one another above the crash of the sea. Then one of them, her uncle it was, she recognized his great loping stride and massive shoulders, held up his hand for silence. And they waited, all of them, standing upon the shingle with the waves breaking beyond their feet. Spread out in a thin line they were, like crows, their black forms outlined against the white breach. Mary watched with them, and out of the mist and darkness came another pinprick of light in answer to the first. This new light did not dance and waver as the one on the cliff had done. It dipped low and was hidden, like a traveler weary of his burden. And then it would rise again, pointing high to the sky, a hand flung into the night in a last and desperate attempt to break the wall of mist that hitherto had defied penetration. The new light drew nearer to the first. The one compelled the other. Soon they would merge and become two white eyes in the darkness, and still the men crouched motionless upon the narrow strand, waiting for the lights to close with one another. The second light dipped again, and now Mary could see the shadowed outline of a hull, the black spars like fingers spreading above it, while a white, surging sea combed beneath the hull and hissed and withdrew again. Closer drew the masked light to the flare upon the cliff, fascinated and held, like a moth coming to a candle. Mary could bear it no more. She scrambled to her feet and ran down upon the beach, shouting and crying, waving her hands above her head, pitting her voice against the wind and the sea, which tossed it back to her in mockery. Someone caught hold of her and forced her down upon the beach. Hands stifled her. She was trodden upon and kicked. Her cries died away, smothered by the coarse sacking that choked her, and her arms were dragged behind her back and knotted together, the rough cord searing her flesh. They left her then, with her face in the shingle, the breakers sweeping towards her not 20 yards away. And as she lay there helpless, the breath knocked from her and her scream of warning strangled in her throat, she heard the cry that had been hers become the cry of others and fill the air with sound. The cry rose above the searing smash of the sea and was seized and carried by the wind itself. And with the cry came the tearing splinter of wood, the horrible impact of a massive live thing finding resistance, the shuddering groan of twisting, breaking timber. Drawn by a magnet, the sea hissed away from the strand, and a breaker running high above its fellows flung itself with a crash of thunder upon the lurching ship. Mary saw the black mass that had been a vessel row slowly upon its side, like a great flat turtle. The masts and spars were threads of cotton, crumbled and fallen. Clinging to the slippery, sloping surface of the turtle were little black dots that would not be thrown, that stuck themselves fast to the splintering wood like limpets. And when the heaving, shuddering mass beneath them broke monstrously in two, cleaving the air, they fell one by one into the white tongues of the sea, little black dots without life or substance. A deadly sickness came upon Mary, and she closed her eyes, her face pressed into the shingle. The silence and the stealth were gone. The men who had waited during the cold hours waited no more. They ran like madmen hither and thither upon the beach, yelling and screaming, demented and inhuman. They waded waist deep into the breakers, careless of danger, all caution spent, snatching at the bobbing, sodden wreckage borne in on the surging tide. They were animals, fighting and snarling over lengths of splintered woods. They stripped some of them and ran naked into the cold December night, the better to fight their way into the sea and plunge their hands amongst the spoil that the breakers tossed to them. They chattered and squabbled like monkeys, tearing things from one another, and one of them kindled a fire in the corner by the cliff, the flame burning strong and fierce in spite of the mizzling rain. The spoils of the sea were dragged up the beach and heaped beside it. The fire cast a ghastly light upon the beach, throwing a yellow brightness that had been black before, and casting long shadows down the beach where the men ran backwards and forwards, industrious and horrible. When the first body was washed ashore, mercifully spent and gone, they clustered around it, diving amongst the remains with questing, groping hands, picking it clean as a bone, and when they had stripped it bare, tearing even at the smashed fingers in search of rings, they abandoned it again, leaving it to loll upon its black in the scum where the tide had been. Whatever had been the practice hitherto, there was no method in their work tonight. They robbed haphazard, each man for himself. Crazed they were and drunk, mazed with the success they had not planned. Dogs snapping at the heel of their master, whose venture had proved a triumph, whose power this was, this glory. They followed him where he ran naked amongst the breakers, the water streaming from the hair on his body, a giant above them all. The tide turned, the water receded, and a new chill came upon the air. The light that swung above them on the cliff, still dancing in the wind, like an old mocking man whose joke has long been played, turned pallid now and dim. A gray color came upon the water and was answered by the sky. At first the men did not notice the change. They were delirious still, intent upon their prey. And then Joss Merlin himself lifted his great head and sniffed the air, turning about him as he stood, watching the clear contour of the cliffs as the darkness slipped away. And he shouted suddenly, calling the men to silence, pointing to the sky that was leaden now and pale. They hesitated, glancing once more at the wreckage that surged and fell in the trough of the sea, unclaimed as yet and waiting to be salved. And then they turned with one accord and began to run up the beach towards the entrance of the gully, silent once more, without words or gesture, their faces grayed and scared in the broadening light. They had outstayed their time. Success had made them careless. The dawn had broken upon them unawares, and by lingering over long they had risked the accusation which daylight would bring to them. The world was waking up around them. Night that had been their ally covered them no more. It was Joss Merlin who pulled the sacking away from her mouth and jerked Mary to her feet. Seeing that her weakness had become part of her now and could not be withstood, for she could neither stand alone nor help herself in any way, he cursed her furiously, glancing behind him at the cliffs that every minute became harder, more distinct. And then he bent down to her, for she had stumbled to the ground again, and threw her over his shoulder as he would a sack. Her head lolled without support, her arms lifeless, and she felt his hands pressing into her scarred side, bruising it once more, rubbing the numb flesh that had lain upon the shingle. He ran with her up the strand to the entrance of the gully, and his companions, caught up already in a mesh of panic, flung the remnants of the spoil they had snatched from the beach upon the backs of the 3 horses tethered there. Their movements were feverish and clumsy, and they worked without direction, as though unhinged, lacking all sense of order, while the landlord, sober now from necessity and strangely ineffectual, cursed and bullied them to no avail. The carriage, stuck at the bank halfway up the gully, resisted their efforts to extract it, and this sudden reverse to their fortune increased the panic and stampede. Some of them began to scatter up the lane, forgetting everything in a blind concentration on personal safety. Dawn was their enemy, and more easily withstood alone in the comparative security of ditch and hedge than in the company of 5 or 6 upon the road. Suspicion would lie in numbers here on the coast, where every face was known and strangers were remarkable. But a poacher, or a tramp, or gypsy could make his way alone, finding his own cover and his own path. These deserters were cursed by those who remained, struggling with the carriage, and now, through stupidity and panic, the vehicle was wrenched from the bank in so rough a manner that it overturned, falling upon one side and smashing a wheel. This final disaster let loose pandemonium on the gullyway. There was a wild rush to the remaining farm cart that had been left further up the lane, and to the already overburdened horses. Someone, still obedient to the leader and with a sense of necessity, put fire to the broken carriage, whose presence in the lane screamed danger to them all, and the riot that followed, fight between man and man for the possession of the farm cart that might yet carry them away inland, was a hideous scrap of tooth and nail, of teeth smashed by stones, of eyes cut open by broken glass. Those who carried pistols now had the advantage, and the landlord, with his remaining ally Harry the peddler by his side, stood with his back to the cart and let fly amongst the rabble, who, in the sudden terror of pursuit that would follow with the day, looked upon him now as an enemy, a false leader who had brought them to destruction. The first shot went wide and stubbed the soft bank opposite, but it gave one of the opponents a chance to cut the landlord's eye open with a jagged flint. Joss Merlin marked his assailant with his second shot, spattering him in mid-stomach, and while the fellow doubled over in the mud amongst his companions, mortally wounded and screaming like a hare, Harry the peddler caught another in the throat, the bullet ripping the windpipe, the blood spouting jets like a fountain. I just have to take a moment, because this is a violent encounter that I was not ready for. It was the blood that won the cart for the landlord, for the remaining rebels, hysterical and lost at the sight of their dying fellows, turned as one man and scudded like scrabs up the twisting lane, intent only on putting a safe distance between themselves and their late leader. The landlord leant against the cart with smoking, murderous pistol, the blood running freely from the cut in his eye. Now that they were alone, he and the peddler wasted little time. What wreckage had been salved and brought to the gully they threw upon the cart beside Mary. Miscellaneous odds and ends, useless and unprofitable, the main store still down on the beach and washed by the tide. They dared not risk the fetching of it, for that would be the work of a dozen men, and already the light of day had followed the early dawn and made clear the countryside. There was not a moment to spare. The 2 men who had been shot sprawled in the lane beside the cart. Whether they still breathed or not was not a matter to be discussed. Their bodies bore witness and must be destroyed. It was Harry the peddler who dragged them to the fire. It burnt well, much of the cart was already consumed, while one red wheel stuck out above the charred and splintered wood. Joss Merlin led the remaining horses to the traces, and without a word the 2 men climbed into the cart and jerked the horses to action. Lying on her back in the cart, Mary watched the low clouds pass across the sky. Darkness had gone, the morning was damp and gray. She could still hear the sound of the sea, more distant and less insistent, a sea that had spent its full fury and now let itself be carried by the tide. The wind had dropped too. The tall stems of grass on the banks above the gully were still, and a silence had come upon the coast. There was a smell in the air of damp earth and turnips, of a mist that had lain overnight upon the land. The clouds became one with the gray sky. Once again, a thin mizzle of rain fell upon Mary's face and upon her upturned hands. The wheels of the cart crunched the uneven lane, and turning right, came out upon a smoother surface of gravel that was a road running northwards between low hedges. From far away, across many fields and scattered plowlands, came the merry peals of bells, odd and discordant in the morning air. She remembered suddenly that it was Christmas Day. Oof. If I was reading this without you guys' company, I would definitely put the book down, take a minute, have a cup of coffee perhaps, and come back, because I have goose chills from that chapter. Well done, Mr. Maurier. Oof. All right. But we soldier on to chapter 12. Happy Christmas, everyone. The square pane of glass was familiar to her. It was larger than the carriage window and had a ledge before it, and there was a crack across the pane that she remembered well. She kept her eyes upon it, struggling with memory, and she wondered why she no longer felt the rain on her face and the steady current of wind. There was no movement under her, and her first thought was that the carriage had come to a standstill, thrust against the bank on the gully once more, and that circumstance and fate would compel her to react in frightful repetition the things she had already performed. When she climbed through the window, she would fall and bruise herself, and heading up yet again to the twisting lane, would come across Harry the peddler, squatting in his ditch, but this time she would not have the strength to withstand him. Down on the shingle strand, the men waited for the tide, and the great black turtle of a ship rolled fat and monstrous on the trough of the sea. Mary moaned and turned her head restlessly from side to side. Out of the tail of her eyes, she saw the brown discolored wall beside her and the rusty nail-head where a text had once been hung. She was lying in her bedroom at Jamaica Inn. The sight of this room she hated, however cold it was and drear, was at least protection from the wind and the rain and from the hands of Harry the peddler. Nor could she hear the sea. The roar of surf would not disturb her again. If death came now, he would be an ally. Existence was not a thing she welcomed anymore. Life had been crushed from her, anyway, and the body lying on the bed did not belong to her. She had no wish to live. Shock had made a dummy of her and taken away her strength. Tears of self-pity welled into her eyes. Now there was a face bending down to her, and she shrank back against the pillow, her hands thrust outward and protesting. For the puffy mouth and broken teeth of the peddler were ever in her mind. Her hands were held gently, though, and the eyes that peered at her, red-rimmed like her own from weeping, were tremulous and blue. It was Aunt Patience. They clung to one another, seeking comfort in proximity, and after Mary had wept a while, easing herself of sorrow and allowing the tide of emotion to carry her to the limit, nature took command of her again, and she was strengthened, something of the old courage and force coming back to her again. "You know what has happened?" she asked, and Aunt Patience held her hands tightly so that they could not be withdrawn, the blue eyes begging dumbly for forgiveness like an animal punished through no fault of his own. "How long have I lain here?" Mary questioned, and she was told that this was the second day. For a moment or two Mary was silent, considering the information new to her and sudden. 2 days was a long time. 2 days was a long time to one who but a few moments ago had watched the dawn break on the coast. Much could happen in that time, and she had been on her bed here, helpless. "You should have woken me," she said roughly, pushing away the hands that clung to her. "I'm not a child to be mothered and pampered because of a few bruises. There's work for me to do. You don't understand." Aunt Patience stroked her, the caress timid and ineffectual. "You could not move," she whimpered. "Your poor body was bleeding and broken. I bathed you while you were still unconscious. I thought at first they had injured you terribly, but thank the dear Lord, no real harm has come to you. Your bruises will heal, and your long sleep has rested you. You know who did it, don't you? You know where they took me?" Bitterness had made her cruel. She knew that the words acted like a lash, and she could not stop herself. She began to talk about the men in the shore. Now it was the elder woman's turn to whimper, and when Mary saw the thin mouth working, the vapid blue eyes stare back at her in terror, she became sickened of herself and could not continue. She sat up in bed and swung her legs to the floor, her head swimming with the effort, her temples throbbing. "What are you going to do?" Aunt Patience pulled at her nervously, but her niece shook her aside and began to drag on her clothes. "I have business of my own," she said curtly. "Your uncle is below. He will not let you leave the inn. I'm not afraid of him. Mary, for your sake, for my sake, do not anger him again. You know what you have suffered already. Ever since he returned with you, he has sat below, white and terrible, a gun across his knees. The doors of the inn are barred. I know you have seen and endured horrible, unspeakable things. But Mary, don't you understand? If you go down now, he may hurt you again. He may even kill you. I have never seen him like this. I can't answer for his mood. Don't go down, Mary. I beg you on my knees not to go down." She began to drag on the floor, clutching at Mary's skirt, grasping at her hands and kissing them. The sight was miserable, unnerving. "Aunt Patience, I have gone through enough out of loyalty to you. You can't expect me to stand any more. Whatever Uncle Joss may have been to you once, he is inhuman now. All your tears won't save him from justice. You must realize that. He's a brute, half mad with brandy and blood. Men were murdered by him on the shore. Don't you understand? Men were drowned in the sea. I can see nothing else. I shall think of nothing else to my dying day." Her voice rose dangerously high. Hysteria was not far away. She was still too weak for consecutive thought and saw herself running out upon the high road, crying loudly for the help that would surely be forthcoming. Aunt Patience prayed too late for silence. The warning finger was unheeded. The door opened, and the landlord of Jamaica Inn stood on the threshold of the room. Yes, Aunt Patience is a little off on what she thinks is right and wrong, definitely. He stooped his head under the beam and stared at them. He looked haggard and gray. The cut above his eye was still a vivid scarlet. He was filthy and unwashed, and there were black shadows beneath his eyes. "I thought I heard voices in the yard," he said. "I went to a chink in the shutters downstairs in the parlor, but I saw no one. Did you hear anything from this room?" Nobody answered. Aunt Patience shook her head, the little nervous smile that she conjured for his presence trailing uneasily across her face without her knowledge. He sat down on the bed, his hands plucking at the clothes, his restless eyes roaming from the window to the door. "He'll come," he said. "He's bound to come. I've cut my own throat. I've gone against him. He warned me once, and I laughed at him. I didn't listen. I wanted to play the game on my own. We're as good as dead, all three of us sitting here. You, Patience and Mary and I. We're finished, I tell you. The game is up. Why did you let me drink? Why didn't you break every last bottle in the house and turn the key on me and let me die? I did not have hurt you. I'd not have touched a hair on your heads, either of you. Now it's too late. The end has come. He looked from one to the other of them, his bloodshot eyes hollow, his massive shoulders humped to his back. They stared back at him without understanding, dumbfounded and awed in the expression on his face they had not seen before. What do you mean? Said Mary at length. Who are you afraid of? Who warned you off? He shook his head and his hand strayed to his mouth, the fingers restless. No, he said slowly. I am not drunk now, Mary Yellan. My secrets are still my own. But I'll tell you one thing, and there's no escape for you. You're in it now as much as Patience there. We have enemies on either side of us now. We have the law on one hand, and on the other... He checked himself, the old cunning in his eyes once more as he glanced at Mary. You'd like to know, wouldn't you? He said. You'd like to sneak out of the house with the names on your lips and betray me. You'd like to see me hanged. All right, I don't blame you for it. I've hurt you enough to make you remember to the last of your days, haven't I? But I saved you too, didn't I? Have you thought of what that rabble would have done to you had I not been there? He laughed and spat on the floor, something of his usual self returning to him. You can put one good mark against me for that one, he said. Nobody touched you that night but myself, and I've not spoiled your pretty face. Cuts and bruises mend, don't they? Why, you poor weak thing, you know as well as I do I could have had your first week at Jamaica Inn if I wanted to. You're a woman, after all. Yes, by heaven, and you're lying at my feet right now, like your Aunt Patience, crushed and contented and clinging. Another goddamn bloody fool. Let's get out of here. This room stinks of damp and decay. He shambled to his feet, dragging her after him into the passage, and when they came to the landing, he thrust her against the wall beneath the candle stuck on the bracket so that the light fell upon her bruised, cut face. He took her chin in his hands and held her for a moment, smoothing the scratches with delicate, light fingers. She stared back at him in loathing and disgust, the gentle, graceful hands reminding her of all she had lost and renounced. And when he bent his hated face lower, indifferent of Patience who stood beside him, and his mouth, so like his brother's, hovered an instant on hers, the illusion was horrible and complete, and she shuddered and closed her eyes. He blew out the light. They followed him down the stairs without a word, their footsteps pattering sharply through the empty house. He led the way into the kitchen, where even there the door was bolted and the window barred. 2 candles were on the table to light the room. Then he turned and faced the 2 women. Reaching for a chair, he straddled his legs across it and considered them, fumbling in his pockets for his pipe meanwhile and filling it. We've got to think out a plan of campaign, he said. We've been sitting here for nigh on 2 days now, like rats in a trap, waiting to be caught. And I've had enough, I tell you. I never could play that sort of game. It gives me the horrors. If there's going to be a scrap, then my almighty God, let's have it in the open. He puffed a while at his pipe, staring moodily at the floor, tapping his foot on the stone flags. Harry's loyal enough, he continued, but he'll split and have the house about our ears if he thought there'd be profit for himself. As for the rest, they're scattered over the countryside, whining, their tails between their legs like a blasted pack of curs. This has scared him forever. Yes, and it scared me too, you can know that. I'm sober now, all right. I can see the damn fool unholy mess I've landed in, and we'll be lucky, all of us, if we get out of it without swinging. You, Mary, can laugh if you'd like with your white, contemptuous face. It'll be as bad for you as for Patience and I. You're in it too, up to the neck. You'll not escape. Why didn't you turn the key on me, I say? Why didn't you stop me from drinking? His wife stole over to him and plucked at his jacket, passing her tongue over her lips in preparation for speech. Well, what is it? He said fiercely. Why, we can't creep away now. Why can't we creep away now before it's too late? She whispered. The trap's in the stable. We'll be in Launceston and across to Devon in a few hours. We could travel by night. We could make for the eastern countries. You damned idiot, he shouted. Don't you realize there are people on the road between here and Launceston who think I'm the devil himself, who are only waiting their chance to fasten every crime in Cornwall on my head and get me? The whole country knows by now what happened on the coast on Christmas Eve, and if they see us bolting, they'll have the proof. God, don't you think I haven't itched to get away and save my skin? Yes, and by doing so, have every man in the country point his finger at us? We'll look fine, wouldn't we? Riding on the trap on top of our goods and chattels like farmers on market day, waving goodbye in Launceston Square. No, we've got one chance, one single chance in a million. We've got to lie quiet. We've got to lie mum. If we sit here tight at Jamaica Inn, they may start scratching their heads and rubbing their noses. They've got to look for proof, mind you. They've got to set up the sworn proof before they lay hands on us. And unless one of the blasted rabble turns informer, they won't get the proof. Oh, yes, the ship's there with her back broken on the rocks, and there's chunks of stuff lying on the beach, piles of it, ready to take away, put there by someone, they'll say. They'll find 2 bodies, charred to cinders, and a heap of ashes. What's this? They'll say. There's been a fire. There's been a scrap. It'll look dirty. It'll look bad for many of us, but where's your proof? Answer me that. I spent my Christmas Eve like a respectful man on the bosom of my family, playing cat's cradle and snapdragon with my niece. He put his tongue in his cheek and winked. You've forgotten one thing, haven't you? Said Mary. No, my dear, I have not. The driver of that carriage was shot, and he fell in the ditch not a quarter of a mile down the road outside. You were hoping we'd left the body there, weren't you? Maybe it will shock you, Mary, but the body traveled with us to the coast, and it lies now, if I remember rightly, beneath a 10-foot bank of shingle. Of course, someone's going to miss him. I'm prepared for that. But as they'll never find his carriage, it doesn't make much odds. Maybe he was tired of his wife and has driven to Penzance. They're welcome to look for him there. And now that we've both come to our senses again, you can tell me what you were doing in that carriage, Mary, and where you had been. If you don't answer me, you know me well enough by then. I can find a way of making you talk. Mary glanced at her aunt. The woman was shivering like a frightened dog, her blue eyes fixed upon her husband's face. Mary thought rapidly. It was easy enough to lie. Time was the all-important factor now and must be reckoned with and cherished if she and her Aunt Patience were to come out of this alive. She must play upon it and give her uncle rope enough to hang himself. His confidence would go against him in the end. She had one hope of salvation, and he was near, not 5 miles away, waiting in Alternan for a signal from her. I'll tell you my day, and you can believe it or not, she said. It doesn't matter much to me what you think. I walked to Launceston on Christmas Eve and went to the fair. I was tired by 8 o'clock, and when it came to rain and blow, I was wet through and fit for nothing. I hired that carriage, and I told the man I wanted him to take me to Bodmin. I thought if I said Jamaica Inn, he would have refused the journey. There, I've nothing more to tell you than that. Were you alone in Launceston? Of course I was alone. And you spoke to no one? I bought a handkerchief from a woman at a stall. Joss Merlin spat on the floor. All right, he said. Whatever I did to you now, you'd tell me the same story, wouldn't you? You've got the advantage for once, because I can't prove if you're lying or not. Not many maids your age would spend the day alone at Launceston, I could tell you that. Nor would they drive home by themselves. If your story's true, then our prospects improve. They'll never trace that driver here. Damn it, I shall feel like another drink in a moment. He tilted back his chair and pulled out his pipe. You shall drive in your own coach yet, Patience, he said, and wear feathers in your bonnet and a velvet cloak. I'm not beaten yet. I'll see the whole band of them in hell first. You wait. We'll start fresh again. We'll live like fighting cocks. Maybe I'll turn sober and go to church on Sundays. And you, Mary, you shall hold my hand in my old age and spoon me my food. He threw back his head and laughed. But his laugh broke short in the middle, his mouth shut like a trap, and he crashed his chair down on the floor again and stood in the middle of the room, his body turned sideways, his face as white as a sheet. Listen, he whispered hoarsely. Listen. They followed the direction of his eyes, fastened as they were upon the chink of light that came through the narrow gap in the shutters. Something was scraping gently at the kitchen window, tapping lightly, softly, scratching furtively at the pane of glass. It was like the sound made by a branch of ivy when it is broken loose from the trunk and, bending downwards, teases a window or a porch, disturbed and restless with every breath of wind. But there was no ivy on the slate walls of Jamaica Inn, and the shutters were bare. The scraping continued, persuasive and undaunted. Tap, tap, like the drumming of a beak. Tap, tap, like the four fingers of a hand. There was no other sound in the kitchen except the frightened breathing of Aunt Patience, whose hand crept out across the table to her niece. Mary watched the landlord as he stood motionless on the kitchen floor, his figure shadowed monstrously on the ceiling, and she saw his lips blue through the dark stubble of his beard. Then he bent forward, crouching on tiptoe like a cat, and sliding his hand along the floor, his fingers fastened themselves upon his gun that stood against the further chair, never once taking his eyes from the chink of light between the shutters. Mary swallowed, her throat dry as dust. Whether the thing behind the window was a friend or enemy to herself made the suspense more poignant. But in spite of her hopes, the thumping of her heart told her that fear was infectious, as were the beads of perspiration on her uncle's face. Her hands wandered to her mouth, trembling and clammy. For a moment he waited beside the closed shutters, and then he sprang forward, tearing at the hinge and pulling them apart. The gray light of afternoon slanted at once into the room. A man stood outside the window, his livid face pressed against the pane, his broken teeth gaping in an evil grin. It was Harry the peddler. Joss Merlin swore and threw open the window. "God damn you, come inside, can't you?" he shouted. "Do you want a bullet in your guts, you blasted fool? You've had me standing like a deaf mute for 5 minutes with my gun trained on your belly. Unbolt the door, Mary. Don't lean against the wall there like a ghost. There's nerves enough in this house without you turning sour." Like all men who have been badly scared, he threw the blame of his own panic upon the shoulders of another and now blustered to reassure himself. Mary crossed slowly to the door. The sight of the peddler brought back a vivid memory of her struggle in the lane, and reaction came swift upon her. Her nausea and disgust returned in force, and she could not look upon him. She opened the door without a word, screening herself behind it, and when he came into the kitchen, she turned at once and went to the dull fire, piling the turf upon the embers mechanically, her back towards him. "Well, have you brought news?" questioned the landlord. The peddler smacked his lips in reply and jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "Country's gone in for a smoke," he said. "Every clattering tongue in Cornwall, from the Tamar to St. Ives. I was in Bodeman this forenoon. The town was ringing with it, and they're hot mad for blood and justice, too. Last night I slept at Camelford, every man jack in the place shaking his fist in the air and babbling to his neighbor. There'll be only one end to this storm, Joss, and you know the name of it, don't you?" He made a gesture with his hands across his throat. "We've got to run for it," he said. "It's our only chance. The roads are poison, and Bodmin and Lanson worst of all. I'll keep to the moors and get to Devon, above Gunnis Lake. It'll take me longer, I know that, but what's the odds if you save your skin? Have you got a bite of bread in the house, missus? I've not touched food since yesterday forenoon." He threw his question at the landlord's wife, but his glance fell upon Mary. Patience Merlin fumbled in the cupboard for bread and cheese, her mouth working nervously, her movements clumsy, her mind anywhere but on her mission. As she laid the table, she looked beseechingly at her husband. "You hear what he says?" she pleaded. "It's madness to stop here. We must go now, at once, before it's too late. You know what this means to the people. They'll have no mercy on you. They'll kill you without trial. For God's sake, listen to him, Joss. You know I don't care for myself. It's for you." "Shut your mouth, can't you?" thundered her husband. "I've never asked your counsel yet, and I don't ask it now. I can face what's coming to me alone, without you bleeding beside me like a sheep. So you'll throw your hand in too, Harry, will you? Run with your tail between your legs because a lot of clerks and Wesleyans are howling to Jesus for your blood? Have they proved it on us? Tell me that. Or has your liver conscience gone against you? Damn my conscience, Joss. It's common sense I'm thinking of. This part of the country has become unhealthy, and I'll go from it while I can. As to proof, We've sailed close enough to the wind these last months to be proof enough, haven't we? I've stuck to you, haven't I? Come out here today, risking my neck to give you warning. I'm not saying anything against you, Joss, but it was your damned stupidity brought us to this mess, wasn't it? You got us mad drunk like yourself and led us to the shore on a crazy, harebrained venture that none of us had planned. We took a chance in a million, and the chance came off too damned bloody well. Because we were drunk, we lost our heads, left the stuff, and 100 tracks scattered on the shore. And whose fault was it? Why, yours, I say. He smashed his fist on the table, his yellow, impudent face thrust close to the landlord, a sneer on his cracked lips. Joss Merlin considered him for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was dangerous and low. So you accuse me, do you, Harry? He said. You're like the rest of your kind, wriggling like a snake when the luck of the game turns against you. You've done well out of me, haven't you? Had gold to burn you never had before. Lived like a prince all these months instead of at the bottom of a mine where you belong. And supposing we'd kept our heads the other night and cleared in order before dawn, as we'd done 100 times before, you'd be sucking up to me now to fill your pockets, wouldn't you? You'd be fawning on me with the rest of the sniffing curs, begging your share of the spoil, calling me God Almighty. You'd lick my boots and lie down in the dust. Run, then, if you'd like. Run to the Tamar Bank with your tall... Found a typo. Run, then, if you'd like. Run to the Tamar Bank with your tail between your legs and be damned to you. I'll take the world on alone. The peddler forced a laugh and shrugged his shoulders. We can talk, can't we, without cutting each other's throats? I'm not gone against you. I'm on your side still. We were all mad drunk on Christmas Eve. I know that. Let's leave it alone. What's done is done. Our lot is scattered, and we needn't reckon with them. They'll be too scared to show their heads and worry us. That leaves you and I, Joss. We've been in this business, the pair of us, deeper than most. I know that, and the more we help each other, the better it'll be for us both. Now then, that's why I'm here, to talk it over and see where we stand. He laughed again, showing his soft gums, and began to beat a tattoo on the table with his squat black fingers. The landlord watched him coolly and reached once more for his pipe. Just what would you be driving at, Harry? He said, leaning against the table and filling his pipe afresh. The peddler sucked his teeth and grinned. I'm not driving in anything. I want to make things easier for us. We've got to quit, that's evident, unless we want to swing. But it's like this, Joss. I don't see the fun in quitting empty-handed for all that. There's a mint of stuff we dumped along the road yonder 2 days ago from the shore. That's right, isn't it? And by rights, it belongs to all of us who worked for it on Christmas Eve. But there's none of them left to claim it but you and I. I'm not saying there's much value there. It's junk mostly, no doubt. But I don't see why some of it shouldn't help us into Devon, do you? The landlord blew a cloud of smoke into his face. So you didn't come back to Jamaica Inn because of my sweet smile alone then, he said. I was thinking you were fond of me, Harry, and wanted to hold my hand. The peddler grinned again and shifted in his chair. All right, he said. We're friends, aren't we? There's no harm done in plain speaking. The stuff's there, and it'll take 2 men to shift it. The women here can't do it. What's against you and I striking a bargain and being done with it? The landlord puffed thoughtfully on his pipe. You're teeming with ideas, all strung out as pretty as the fancy trinkets on your tray, my friend. And supposing the stuff isn't there, after all, supposing I've disposed of it already. I've been here kicking my heels for 2 days, and the coach has passed my door. What then, Harry boy? The grin faded from the face of the peddler, and he thrust out his jaw. What's the joke? He snarled. Do you play a double game up here at Jamaica Inn? You'll find it hasn't paid you if you have. You've been mighty silent sometimes, Joss Merlin, when cargoes were run and when we'd had the wagons on the road. I've seen things sometimes I haven't understood, and heard things too. You've made a brilliant job of this trade, month in, month out. Too brilliant, some of us thought, for the small profit we made out of it, who took most of the risks. And we didn't ask you how you did it, did we? Listen here, Joss Merlin. Do you take your orders from someone above you? The landlord was on him in a flash. He caught the peddler on the point of the chin with his clenched fist, and the man went over backward onto his head, the chair beneath him striking the stone flags with a crash. He recovered instantly and scrambled to his knees, but the landlord towered above him, the muzzle of his gun pointed at the peddler's throat. "Move, and you're a dead man," he said softly. Harry the peddler looked up at his assailant, his little mean eyes half closed, his puffy face yellow. The fall had winded him, and he breathed shortly. At the first sign of a struggle, Aunt Patience had flattened herself against the wall, terror-stricken, her eyes searching those of her niece in vain appeal. Mary watched her uncle closely. She had no clue this time to his state of mind. He lowered his gun and pushed at the peddler with his foot. "Now we can talk reason, you and I," he said. He leant once more against the table, his gun across his arm, while the peddler sprawled, half kneeling, half crouching on the floor. "I'm the leader in this game, and always have been," said the landlord slowly. "I've worked it from the beginning 3 years ago, when we ran cargo from little 12-ton luggers to Pasdo, and thought ourselves lucky when we were given 7 pence halfpenny in pocket. I've worked it until the trade was the biggest thing in the country, from Hartland to Hale. I take orders? My God, I'd like to see the man who dared tried me. Well, it's over now. We've run our course and the day is done. The game is up for all of us. You didn't come here tonight to warn me. You came to see what you could get out of the smash. The inn was barred and your little mean heart rejoiced. You scraped at the window there because you knew from experience that the hasp of the shutter is loose and easy to force. You didn't think you'd find me here, did you? You thought it would be Patience here, or Mary, and you would scare them easy, wouldn't you, and reach for my gun where it hangs handily on the wall, as you've so often seen, and then to hell with the landlord of Jamaica Inn. You little rat, do you think I didn't see it in your eyes when I flung back the shutter and saw your face in the window? Do you think I never heard your gasp of surprise, nor watched your sudden yellow grin?" The peddler passed his tongue over his lips and swallowed. He threw a glance towards Mary, motionless by the fire, the round button of his eyes watchful like a cornered rat's. He wondered if she would throw the dice against him, but she said nothing. She waited for her uncle. "Very well. We'll strike a bargain, you and I, as you've suggested." "We'll come to handsome terms. I've changed my mind after all, my loving friend, and with your help, we'll take the road to Devon. There's stuff in this place worth taking, as you reminded me, nor can I load alone. Tomorrow is Sunday and a blessed day of rest. Not even the wrecking of 50 ships will drag the people of this country from their knees. There'll be blinds down and sermons and long faces and prayers offered for poor sailormen who came by misadventure by the devil's hand. But they'll not go seeking the devil on the Sabbath. 24 hours we have, Harry, my boy, and tomorrow night, when you've broken your back spalding turf and turnips on my property and the farm cart, and kissed me goodbye, and Patience too, and maybe Mary there as well, well, then you could go down on your knees and thank Joss Merlin for letting you go free with your life instead of squatting your scut in a ditch where you belong to be with a bullet in your black heart." He raised his gun again, edging the cold muzzle close to the man's throat. The peddler whimpered, showing the whites of his eyes, and the landlord laughed. "You're a pretty marksman in your way, Harry," he said. "Isn't that the spot you touched on Ned Sato the other night? You laid his windpipe bare, and the blood whistled out in the stream. He was a good boy, was Ned, but hasty with his tongue. That's where you got him, wasn't it?" Closer, the muzzle pressed against the peddler's throat. "If I make a mistake now, Harry, your windpipe could come clean just like poor Ned's. You don't want me to make a mistake, do you?" The peddler could not speak. His eyes rolled up in a squint and his hand opened wide, the 4 fingers spread square as though damped to the floor. The landlord shifted his gun, and bending down, he jerked the peddler to his feet. "Come on," he said. "Do you think I'm going to play with you all night? A jest is a jest for 5 minutes. After that, it becomes a burden on the flesh. Open the kitchen door and turn to the right and walk down the passage until I tell you to stop. You can't escape through the entrance to the bar. Every door and window to this place is barred. Your hands have been itching to explore the wreckage we brought from the store, haven't they, Harry? From the shore, haven't they, Harry? You shall spend the night in the storeroom amongst it all. You know, Patience, my dear, I believe this is the first time we've offered hospitality at Jamaica Inn. And I don't count Mary there. She's part of the household. And he laughed. In high good humor, his mood switched round now like a weathercock, and butting his gun into the peddler's neck, he prodded him out of the kitchen and down the dark flagged passage to the store. The door that had been battered in rough and ready manner by Squire Bassett and the servant had been reinforced with new planking and post, and was now strong as, if not stronger than, before. Joss Merlin had not been entirely idle during the past week. After he turned the key on his friend with a parting injunction not to feed the rats, whose numbers had increased, the landlord returned to the kitchen, a rumble of laughter in his chest. I thought Harry would turn sour, he said. I've seen it coming in his eyes for weeks, long before this mess landed on us. He'll fight on the winning side, but he'll bite your hand when the luck turns. He's jealous. He's yellow-green with it, rotten through and through. He's jealous of me. They're all jealous of me. They knew I had brains and hated me for it. What are you staring at me for, Mary? You'd better get your supper and go to bed. You have a long journey before you tomorrow night. I warn you, here and now, it won't be an easy one. Mary looked at him across the table. The fact that she would not be going with him did not concern her for the moment. He might think as he liked about it. Tired as she was, for the strain of all that she had seen and done weighed heavily upon her, her mind was seething with plans. Sometime, somehow, before tomorrow night, she must go to Alternan. Once there, her responsibility was over. Action would be taken by others. It would be hard for Aunt Patience, hard for herself at first, perhaps. She knew nothing of the jingle and complexities of the law, but at least justice would win. It would be easy enough to clear her own name and her aunt's. The thought of her uncle, who sat now before her, his mouth full of stale bread and cheese, standing as he would with his hands bound behind him, powerless for the first time and forever, was something that afforded her exquisite pleasure, and she turned the picture over and over in her mind, improving upon it. Aunt Patience would recover in time, and the years would drain away from her, bringing her peace at last and quietude. Mary wondered how the capture would be effected when the moment came. Perhaps they would set out upon the journey she had arranged, and they would turn upon the road, he laughing at his assurance. They would be surrounded by a band of men, strong in number and in arms, and as he struggled against them hopelessly, borne to the ground by force, she would lean down to him and smile. I thought you had brains, Uncle, she would say to him, and he would know. She dragged her eyes away from him and turned to the dresser for her candle. I'll have no supper tonight, she said. Okay, there it is. I'm going to stop there. We're still about 5 pages from the chapter. And we're not so close to the chapter that we're going to miss anything. So Mary has been sent to bed. Oof, I'm going to say it again. Oof to this reading today. We lost men. A lot of people died for nothing, it turns out, for very, very little. All right. Man, oh man. Okay. So we stopped on page 241, and I will put a little sick thing there. Mary is not having dinner, and we will meet again next time. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Stanley, for popping into the chat. I look forward to seeing you again. Until then, stay safe, drink lots of water, have a really, really good day, and next time. All right. Bye, everybody.